Greetings. Welcome to our special edition panel on energy and the World Cup. I'm Firat Oruc, and together with my colleagues Vicky Gokce and Trish Kajle, who is on leave this year but made us a pleasant surprise tonight, we lead the Energy Humanities Research Initiative, which has been generously supported by the Center for International and Regional Studies. Now, in its second year, our research initiative aims to foreground the importance of lived experiences to the study of energy's past, present, and future. The special edition panel tonight will address issues related to energy and the hosting of the FIFA World Cup 2022 in Qatar. After all, to quote dear Zahra, this is the World Cup that energy made possible. This sums it up. We would like to consider what lessons and avenues World Cup 2022 offers for the energy humanities and how this event and its legacy speak to the issue of mega event infrastructures and energy culture. We are fortunate to have three distinguished panelists to help us navigating the topic, and I'm truly honored to introduce them. Our first speaker, Gokce Gunel, is Associate Professor in Anthropology at Reiche University. She is the author of Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, Duke University Press 2019, which focuses on the construction of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the United Arab Emirates, specifically concentrating on the Masdar City project. Currently, she is at work on a second book project provisionally titled Energy Accumulation. Our second panelist, Laurent Lambert, is a faculty member at the School of Public Administration and Development Economics at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He previously was Senior Policy Analyst at the Social and Economic Survey Research Institute and Senior Administrator of the Qatar Humanitarian Innovation Lab Initiative at Qatar University. In 2015 to 2016, Laurent was a board member of the United Nations Climate Technology Center and Network. His research and policy interests lie at the intersection of water and energy security, environmental risks, climate change, and public policy. The third panelist is one of our very own and one of the few scholars whose research interests combine energy and sports together. Danyel Reiche is a visiting research fellow at the Center for International and Regional Studies and a visiting associate professor at Georgetown University, Qatar, where he leads the research initiative on the FIFA World Cup 2022. As an ever-prolific scholar, just within this year, he published a co-authored book titled Qatar and the 2022 FIFA World Cup, Politics, Controversy, Change, and an edited volume titled Handbook of Sport in the Middle East. The running order for tonight will be as follows. Each of our panelists will give their introductory remarks about the panel theme for about 7 minutes. This will be followed by a moderated discussion session, which will be facilitated by Vicky. And we will then open the floor to audience question. We aim to finish at 7, and we welcome you all to the reception afterwards. Let me now hand it to Gokce to offer remarks.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you for the opportunity to sort of try to think about the sort of the World Cup alongside energy-related issues. So uh, I was trying to, as I was preparing for this panel, I was trying to sort of come up with like different kinds of lenses that the World Cup might facilitate and might allow us to sort of again engage with. And I guess the first one, perhaps the most explicit one here, was the sort of the relationship between post-oil diversification strategies and the World Cup, and so how the sort of the 2030 vision that we see in Qatar and in other parts of the Gulf as well, sort of has allowed for the production of this mega event, and how this and sort of attracted a lot of attention to sort of infrastructures of tourism, infrastructures of sports, and other kinds of possible engagements that might help support Qatar's economy beyond fossil fuels, and how those infrastructures might be seen as sort of ways of sort of preserving the status quo, preserving the kind of welfare that Qatar enjoys today. The second lens was maybe thinking about the kind of maybe more sort of less sort of future oriented, and more about the sort of the how all of these engagements with sort of, again, post-oil diversification campaigns might impact the present. And so the kinds of resources that go into the making of an event like the World Cup. So, and this is both the kind of resources that go into the sort of the construction and the labor that goes into making the World Cup, and also the kind of, I guess, the energy that goes into bringing everyone here for the World Cup, and experiencing the sort of the, I guess, the 2 months that all of you are sort of must be excited to experience here as part of this sort of the relationship that experience might have with energy infrastructures in general. And then maybe the third part of it that I think Firat already talked about this a little bit, is a sort of the legacy that this leaves, right? So what are the kinds of energy infrastructures that remain beyond an event like the World Cup? And I think these kinds of events sometimes serve as spaces of experimentation, and those experiments with different kinds of different kinds of infrastructural solutions might open up sort of the potential to change the ways in which life happens here. And so, for instance, today we were taking the metro to different parts of town, and Vicky and Trish were talking about how all the metro stations have been organized around the stadiums, and how there's a sort of a reorganization of the urban environment based on the kind of work that goes into the making of the World Cup. And so how are what are the kinds of emergent sort of infrastructures of energy that are generated alongside the World Cup? And I think before coming here, I was quite sort of also reading a lot about the kind of air conditioning infrastructure that has been sort of produced specifically for the stadiums, so to sort of do the kind of the outdoor air conditioning. And I guess one of the ways of thinking about those experimental perhaps infrastructures would be to think about how they're going to affect life here. And then the second part of that would be whether they're going to be exported to whether they're going to be relevant in other parts of the world as well. And so, and especially as the world transforms with climate change. So those are just like maybe three very broad questions that sort of bring together the World Cup and energy infrastructures, and might shed a sort of an energy humanities light on the World Cup. But I'll pass it on to. I'm very excited to actually learn from all of you to see how you see the connections between this event and energy very broadly. And I love the phrase the World Cup that's made possible through energy. So I'm excited to hear all their questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, good evening, everyone. So I think there will be just a few slides that I would like to share with you, just so that there is a guided discussion. And yes, I can move forward. So there are many ways to approach the World Cup, and I decided to focus on the link between energy and the World Cup with regards to how it is perceived, and especially how it is perceived abroad. You may have heard that in Europe and the US and Japan, there are some discussions about how sustainable is the World Cup. And so these are some of the things that I would like to talk about. But of course, the discussion can move on later on. First, I'd like to just address the FIFA claims with regards to energy and sustainability of the World Cup, then the accusations, because we have to call them this way, I guess, from outside of Qatar, largely. And then we should ask the question, can someone be right at the end of the discussion or not? And we'll rethink about these kind of debates about sustainability and why it's not as black and white as many would like to portray it. So first, if you go to the website of the FIFA, you'll find a lot of great claims and, of course, gorgeous images about the stadium and so on. But there are some bold sentences, such as, sustainability has been at the heart of the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022 from the very start. And I believe it plays a role. I am sure about it, and I believe a lot of money has been put into it. But these are very, very bold claims. And if you keep on moving into the website, this has become the core of the issue internationally, the key debate. The FIFA claims that there is carbon neutrality. And none of us can really read what is written. But the first sentence says that the FIFA has worked hard, basically, or something like this, maybe I can say it. Our goal is to offset all greenhouse gas emissions while advancing low-carbon solutions in Qatar and the region. This is absolutely nice, wonderful text. The only problem is that they don't say what is carbon neutral. Is it the stadiums? Is it the stadiums plus the venues? Is it the transportation in Doha? And so there is what diplomats may call diplomatic ambiguity. We don't really know what it is about. And so if to some extent it may seem to be neutral and a nice statement, for many people this was seen as hiding a reality or even as greenwashing an event which would have a terrible carbon footprint and lead to pollution and climate change, etc., or accelerate climate change to be more precise. So this is the key debate we have these days. And these accusations of greenwashing are all over the press, as we know. If we read them, too, they have their fair share of, some might say, diplomatic ambiguity. We will not spend time reading critically all these attacks, but there is a certain amount of, I would say, animosity, not just towards the FIFA, not just towards the World Cup, but towards Qatar. And I think there is a certain amount of Qatar bashing. I mean, I have here what CNN says about Qatar, and it starts its article by explaining Qatar has the largest footprint per capita, carbon footprint per capita in the world. So already the text starts, in a very negative manner. And then it explains a number of things, but it just scratches the surface. And what we don't see with these accusations, which are about the actual footprint of the events, about the stadium receiving AC, and the AC has not been calculated in the carbon footprint, meaning the events are way more polluting than the FIFA would say. The problem is that they don't also share their methodologies, and they refer to environmental activists, which is absolutely fine. The only problem is that we don't have their methodologies. So there are a few reports online. Some are developed, some absolutely not, which criticize Qatar a lot, but they fail to provide also the evidence of having a very clear, logical approach to it that cannot be debated. And to some extent, I would just finish this first 7 minutes with this question, can someone be right about it? And the key problem is that there is no real definition of what would be a carbon neutral World Cup. Is it just, again, the stadium and the venues? Is it also all the flights? Because can we have a tournament if there is no one flying in? And of course, the flights are not carbon neutralized, right? So at the end of the day, we have a problem here that we don't have any strict definition everyone would agree upon. And thus, we can, of course, say to Qatar, well, you do some greenwashing, you say it's carbon neutral, but if we look at this and that, it is not. However, at the same time, we do not give Qatar a fair chance, because on all the obvious elements, they have paid for carbon emissions to be offset. Now, of course, there is one more issue in terms of debate, which is that, first, amid the climate crisis that we know, is it fair that some countries can emit CO2 a lot because they are rich and they can pay off for it? This is an eternal ethical question. And we would have other questions, but I think I will leave to my colleagues to explore and debate about this. But at the end of the day, I'm saying that this is really a debate academics have, but we don't have any actual standard definitions that enable us to say, yes, Qatar is doing what he said it would deliver or not. Thank you.
First of all, Mabruk, Qatar. I don't know whether you have read it, but today Qatar was awarded the hosting rights of the 2023 AFC Asian Cup, which I think is excellent in terms of sustainability, because it means that all the beautiful stadiums will be used for one more big event. And when we talk about more mega sporting events and sustainability, the main issue in the literature is white elephants, so that many mega sporting events have left infrastructure that is not being used anymore afterwards, or not sufficiently used. And maybe the best news about this World Cup is that there are not 10 stadiums like in South Africa and not 12 stadiums like in Russia, that there are only 8 stadiums. And what is new is that for the first time there is a temporary stadium. So we need to explain to you, because you're visiting, there's one stadium built of shipping containers, which is temporary and will be completely dismantled after the event. There's another stadium, Lucé, where the final will be played, that will be transformed into a community hub afterwards. And most of the other stadiums will be reduced in size, including our stadium here in Education City. So there has been some thinking into avoiding the white elephants that have witnessed previous mega sporting events. The major marketing claim of the World Cup is, as Laurent said, that it's the first carbon neutral World Cup. I'm not so excited about this claim, because at the very end, this is about carbon neutrality is not possible. And this is about carbon offsetting. So it was promised that there will be a calculation of the emissions during the event, and then afterwards there will be projects to compensate for the emissions. If we review the literature, there is the major issue in the literature on carbon offsetting is, are the projects that happen anyway, or are they characterized by additionality? That's the key issue. So we would need another event in a year or two on the carbon offsetting of this World Cup to make a proper assessment whether that were like good, credible projects. I mean, I would hope that we will witness that, but it's at this point really hard to say. So to broaden the picture a bit, when we look in general at sustainability policies in Qatar, I think, first of all, we have seen very ambitious goals being stated recently. The Emir was the only Gulf leader traveling to the 2021 climate change conference in Glasgow and promising a 25% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. Qatar promised that by 2030 the entire public transportation would be electric, and there's a 5 gigawatt goal by 2035 for photovoltaic installations. So very ambitious goals. We have also witnessed an institutionalization of sustainability. Ministry for Climate Change has been established in 2021. There are other institutions like here in Qatar Foundation. There's EarthNA now, which is Energy Policy Research Institute that has been recently established. And of course, the entire infrastructure, as Gokce mentioned already, the metro, for example, but also environmental certification has become common in Qatar. not only in the World Cup stadiums. For example, our neighboring building from Northwestern University, Qatar, has LEED certification. But certainly challenges remain. If we look at environmental policy indexes, as you mentioned, usually Qatar belongs to the worst countries with one of the largest, or if not the largest, ecological footprints in the world. And per capita, yes. And this will even increase because Qatar is expanding its North gas field from currently 66 to 127 million metric tons exploration by 2027. So the challenges, I think, for the future are that so far reforms have mainly addressed the supply side. So, and I think the demand side needs to be more addressed. So energy prices are pretty low in Qatar. Transportation fuels are very low. For electricity and water, citizens don't pay anything. Residents pay something, and they pay partly good amounts because most people have here large apartments, etc. But still, it's debatable of whether these prices are sufficient. So certainly, this is a key challenge for the future to increase energy prices, which of course is a topic of conflict, but it's not impossible to do so. Some might argue that it's challenging the entire rentier state system, where the state provides society with free resources and tremendous benefits. But we have seen in neighboring countries that it's not impossible. And we have seen it in the UAE. We have particularly seen it in Saudi Arabia, where the energy price reform has been quite ambitious and has been very well designed by providing population with a cash compensation scheme, and it has already led to a decrease of energy consumption. I think it's not possible. It's not impossible in a rentier state system if at the same time other benefits are still guaranteed. So. Finally, why should Qatar change? Of course, one could argue it's such a tiny country and its share in global emissions is so low. But I think, first of all, we are sitting here in a university that is committed to global justice as one of its main values. It's not fair that some countries consume so much more resources than others. According to WWF, if every citizen on the world would consume as much resources as Qatar, then we would need 4.8 planets. And so we have the global justice argument, but there's also the public health argument. Doha belongs to the 5 most polluted cities in the world. So as a resident here, I have this Plum app, so I'm always checking when I do sports outside, what is the AQI value today? Or even when I go on the balcony, I'm checking this. So we have the public health and also economically, it makes sense also as a oil and gas rich country to invest in renewable energies and energy efficiency. And as an example of Norway, for example, shows which produces 99% of its domestic electricity from renewable sources, which helps the environment and also gives the opportunity to, rather than consume domestically local resources, to export them and make more money.
Great, thanks to all 3 of you for your opening remarks. I think, given the time constraints that we have here, I'm just going to take the privilege to maybe ask just one question on behalf of the research group, and then I'll sort of cede the question time to our audience here. But I think your comments have already begun to touch on this dimension. But I wanted to sort of situate the conversation within our sort of broadest goal as a research initiative, which was to think about the theme of energy in everyday life, how people experience
their relationship to energy in a kind of day to day on the scale of the individual life. But of course, the World Cup is this kind of singular event in some ways, and a mega event which has been the sort of horizon of a lot of activity in the country for more than a decade. So I'll just ask you to say a few more words maybe about the ways, if any, that you think this event might bring about sustained changes in the everyday experience of energetic life, and if it does in any way, for whom is that impact going to be most felt?
Right. Shall I? So, this question is very interesting because I think that Danyel touched upon the fact that this World Cup is a transformative mega event. And there are so many certifications now that government need to obtain to do new projects. There are so many certifications universities need to have. There are so many new courses about sustainability. I think we all three, maybe even all four, we teach about sustainability in our universities. In Qatar 10 years ago, by the way, 10 years ago, there was a sort of mega event, which was the climate change negotiations, exactly 10 years ago. And I can tell you, I came here for the climate negotiations. I don't remember any colleagues teaching environmental, except, the pure environmental sciences of water quality or ecology being taught, and political ecology being so widely taught. And now I think there is not a single university in Qatar that has not integrated the issue of climate change, either it's in its curricula or in its activities, and probably in both. So this is a major change, and I find that probably kids and especially students for sure are way more aware than they were 10 years ago. So it's not just due to the World Cup, but the World Cup has contributed. I think the World Cup has contributed to it because it has put so much emphasis on having a carbon neutral event. Again, we can debate about is it really neutral, but it was in the press. The recycled water for grass, etc. It made, some, I think, environmental awareness more widespread and more. Yes. So I think there is a positive legacy in that. I hope it answered your question.
Of course, you can always discuss, is this because of the World Cup or there are other issues? Then one could argue, this is because of the blockade, or is this because of some international treaties? And but certainly, I know that many people, for example, at the FIFA Arab Cup, which was a big testing event, used for the first time the metro. And and I think, is now the environmental certification introduced to Qatar because of the World Cup, and the stadiums have like green certifications. Not sure. It's the marketing of it is a bit like this, but there are plenty of other buildings. But I think they, made it more popular and raised awareness on the issue. So I would say that in general, the impact on the local environment is helping to raise awareness, and there are tangible changes. But on the other hand, as I said, Qatar's pledged now to reduce 25% of its greenhouse gases by 2021, and this requires really ambitious policies. So, and I hope they knew what they are doing, because a lot needs to be done to accomplish this. And I would assume that, debates around policy reforms in the realm of sustainability will be in the center of public discourses in the years to come.
So maybe I'll respond to it by thinking about sort of the not necessarily maybe the consumption side of energy, but the production side. So I'm not exactly sure how the experience of sort of energy production is felt here by either people working in the industry or others that are sort of around the industry. But I can say that, for instance, if you live in Houston, you definitely know the price of oil, or if you or when you follow the sort of the fluctuations in the price of oil, even if you're not necessarily an energy scholar or anyone working in the energy industry. So there's a certain kind of, I think, proximity to resources that comes from being at the center of resource production to begin with. So even without the sort of without an event like the World Cup, I'm assuming that many people who live here are sort of interested in knowing whether who's buying the natural gas or where it's going or how much it's being sold for. And so I guess it may be then an event like the World Cup becomes something that that is generated thanks to thanks to the sort of maybe the positive fluctuations in the natural gas prices or in the oil prices. And so I think there's and then can maybe service as different kinds of goals afterwards. But I think that one kind of everyday experience of energy is through its sort of through the energy markets themselves, even without even if you're not necessarily betting on those markets yourself.
I think at this point, we would love to hear questions from the audience. We have slightly over 20 minutes, and I think would you take over?
Yes. Thanks for this first round of questions. Now the floor is open to your questions. Ilgar S.
Also, you clear that. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for a great discussion. My question is specifically to Professor Lambert. You have mentioned carbon neutrality and that they don't really define what's going to be carbon neutral, the transportation, the flights are going to be happening, stadiums. But do you think anything, let's say we give a definition, right? So anything major is possibly going to become carbon neutral?
No. And even the problem of trying to neutralize the carbon, by offsetting it rather than neutralizing it, because we have to be right, and I think you corrected me or you paid attention to the terminology. It's more important to say it's offset than neutralized, because the carbon actually which has been emitted, let's say to use heavy machinery to build stadiums, is in the atmosphere. It will be there. Now what the best we can do is to compensate it with, like Qatar is doing to some extent, projects with renewables, I think in Turkey, if I'm not mistaken, and financing plantations of trees. Now the problem is that it's not perfect, far from it. So better not doing it initially. Now does that mean I am against development, etc.? No. So it's a very hard question. A lot of people are working on it. There's no perfect answer. So this is why I ended my small slides by the fact that it's an eternal debate. I hope we'll make some progress, but I think fundamentally there are some very deep issues at the core of it that we cannot solve easily. Yeah, thanks.
I see a cluster of questions over there, but I'll go with Mariam, and then I'll come back to you, I promise. Yeah.
Thank you for the panel so far. I think Professor Reiche, you mentioned the fact that energy prices should go up for the general citizenry, in terms of not only like energy prices but also fuel prices for cars. I was wondering how effective that could be in implementation in a country like Qatar, where there aren't actually really many sustainable alternatives for like transport. It's not like you can just go around cycling in 40-degree weather, and also ACs are pretty necessary as well. So I was wondering, how effective could that be in a country like this, and is there a way to kind of make that more effective in its implementation?
So that's a good point, alternatives. But there's we have a conversation on incremental or radical change. I mean, the alternatives would be the radical change. The incremental change would be to choose more efficient options, more efficient technologies. We have, for example, when we look at the cars, many cars are large cars, and the house and apartment sizes are large. You know, if there's anything that is very well studied, then the fact that energy prices have an impact on consumption. And there is a clear correlation between energy prices and the consumption. And we have seen it just in Saudi, where since 2016, the energy demand decreased. So then, of course, the question is how to do it. I think personally it's wrong to have like a two-tier track system for residents and citizens. I think everybody should pay the same for resources. Secondly, there is, of course, an opportunity that you heavily increase prices from one day to another, which I believe is not smart, or to do what some countries have done, an energy tax reform that consists of a plan that increases energy prices step by step on a yearly basis. And the experience shows that if you send a clear signal to the market, if you just say for the next 10 years, every year, the transportation fuels, for example, will be increased by just a couple of real, it gives a signal to the market that people who might be obsessed about a racing car might still buy the racing cars. But you reach with such steps also the people who will take it into consideration when they make their future choices, which car, for example, they buy.
Go ahead.
Hi, so this is a general question for people across the panel. So as we know, over the past 2 years or so, there's been a craze for ESG, especially in the market, especially Qatar as well as championed ESG recently. So do you believe that ESG is a force for good in the coming years, or do you believe it's either a corporate tyranny project, or is it not doing enough? ESG, environmental social governance regulations in the stock market, for example.
Okay, thank you. It's also a very hot debate. This is this debate which fundamentally is about, do you engage the private sector because you think that even there, where is the source of most of the energy consumption, like airlines, etc., can they be part of the solution, or do we need to reform them radically? And the idea of ESG is that we can help them have better standards and to make the incremental changes that they need to reach out a more sustainable pathway. The problem is that then you have a lot of greenwashing that happens. You have a lot of companies which are really good at playing with the figures, and sometimes they don't achieve anything really substantial. And they will be able to say, now we recycle the paper in the company and do a few things like that. Or we planted 50 trees, which may look wonderful, but doesn't compensate anything. So it really depends on how it is actually implemented. If the government of Qatar, and I personally believe the government of Qatar is really committed for simple reasons, is that climate change is very dangerous for a small peninsula, right? Sea level rise is an issue. Is a real issue, and the people in the ministries know about it. So now they are more committed than they were 10 years ago because they have realized a lot what is at stake. But so with regards to ESG, if they are extremely committed to make it meaningful, then it can be a very useful tool, because the private sector is not going away. They want to encourage it. So precisely they should play with ESG the right manner. Not to deter business development, but at the same time that they make a significant contribution to the greater environmental sustainability in the country. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Just a general remark. There is a lot of emphasis on the idea of energy and environment and green and so on. And if we come to a country that is developing and emphasize one aspect. Is that counterproductive, or is that productive? In the sense that, should we look at the whole development holistically? So for example, when we talk about energy prices for electricity, for example, if we look at some countries where the difference between income, between the lowest salaries and the highest salaries is, for example, a certain range, the impact may be different from where we actually have some people who are, like, for example, if you pay 2,000 riyals for your electricity and your income is, for example, a certain amount, and then there are people who, for them, this is, and then you say, okay, for environmental reasons, we need to increase the price, and then you kill these people. Do you need to look at the thing holistically, or just emphasize one aspect and keep, because Qatar, and many countries in this part of the world are trying to please, are trying to appear to be, doing very good work and so on and so forth. They may go along with the recommendations of experts and people from, who know it all and all that. And then what happens is there are consequences, and people are harmed, and nobody is, I don't know. And then another person comes and says, but there are the rights of these other people, and they are looked at completely separately rather than taking a holistic approach. Is there a solution to this, or am I looking at it different?
There's a solution. First of all, who benefits most from low energy prices? The rich, because they consume most. And there are smart policy instruments, and we have seen this regionally in Iran, but particularly in Saudi recently. So they have increased the energy prices, and they pay to every household a compensation separately. And those who consume not much energy, they even gain money with such a scheme. And those who consume a lot, they lose with such a scheme. So there are policy instruments available to take this into consideration, that we do not have social injustice with higher energy prices.
Thanks. And I would add to this question, which is absolutely legitimate. And I think it's very important that when there are subsidy removal or withdrawal, we pay attention to the lower income categories. So that's very important. The good news is that in Qatar it's done. So I was working before at the Social and Economic Survey Research Institute. It's in Qatar University. And one of the first things we worked on, because they were changing the price of vehicle fuel, is how this would affect Qatari families, especially, but not solely, but Qatari families living in what is technically called relative poverty. So some people might be shocked. They may think, well, are there some Qataris who are poor? They are not destitute. This is not absolute poverty, but this is relative poverty, which means that their income is below a certain threshold. And we then provided, because this was our job, recommendations to the government of Qatar, to the ministries who are in charge of such issues, a number of recommendations, because we could demonstrate to them that vehicle fuels was already something important in the spending of these over-indebted, generally, segments of the society. So it's below 5% of the society, 6, 7, depending on the methodology you use. But we have, and I agree with you, some people who may negatively be affected if we just look at environmental optimization. But rest assured that the government of Qatar pays a lot of attention that these families do not unnecessarily suffer from, Qatari families, but also, but the rest of the family, the rest of families as well, because very often, by the way, some of these Qatari families are married or partly married with people who might be from Saudi Arabia or people from Iran, for instance, or from Egypt sometimes, although it's not as often. And so you cannot disentangle so much the two categories. At the end of the day, I fully agree with you. And I think the future is precisely about having these smart forms of reforms of the subsidies. These vouchers which can be given to families so that if they spend a certain amount which corresponds to their size of family, etc., a few criterias, then they can spend it in terms of energy, and basically they have nothing to pay really, except if they overconsume, then they have to pay. But if they underconsume, then they get some benefits. It can be in money, it can be vouchers for other things. It depends on the country. But this works in the US. Opower is a company that does that, and that is working. And I think this should be introduced, hopefully in the future, in some forms by Kahramaa or other institutions to make the system smarter. But I fully agree with you that the social dimension should not be lost for the environmental goals. Yes.
So you can also give incentives for buying energy-friendly technology, like you could give governmental support for people who buy very efficient cars, for example.
But it's only one planet full. There's a very large number of people here who are not Qatari.
I know. Yes.
Who have no voice. They do not have representation. They cannot. They are left in a position. They are not trying. They cannot complain because they don't want to look negative. That they are trying to survive, and in the absence of, even data is a problem to have accurate data. So how can you formulate evidence-based policies when you have no?
It's a very good question, Danyel, to you. Okay, so data, it's true, it's a problem, not widely shared. There are two places which can make national surveys here in Qatar: the ministry in charge of, statistical planning, etc., and with authorization from the Ministry of the Interior, CESRI, so the Social and Economic Survey Research Institute. So these two institutions collaborate on these issues. And when I was working there, this was part of the things they were doing. But I agree with you that the matter of the voices of people who are not Qatari nationals should be also heard, probably even better. And I agree, because in Dubai, there was one major issue, is that when there was a price hike for electricity, there were families which had to leave. They could not save anymore, which may sound incredible, because electricity, we're so used to having it that it became a luxury service for them. And then they had to leave. So this is an issue, and I think Qatar should not suffer from it, because it would be losing so much working force, so much talents, etc., that it would be a great loss for Qatar. So, yes.
I'll come to this part, but Trish, please go ahead, and I promise to come.
So I had a question for you to build off of your comment about our discussion on the metro earlier, because I was thinking when you were speaking about the way that, not just the stadiums, but all of the urban infrastructure that has been built for this event is something that can be read in multiple ways, right? So it's simultaneously the world that fossil fuels built and the World Cup that fossil fuels built. And yet it's also reflecting different elements of Qatari society or people who've been involved in the Cup, their aspirations for a post-oil future or post-gas future. And I was just wondering if you could use some of your other work on the Gulf to sort of reflect on how people live in those kinds of spaces, how they make meaning of them, and sort of what we should expect or see in our own lives as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think when I was working in the UAE, one of the most sort of pertinent frameworks for thinking about those infrastructures was was to engage with them through the idea of potentiality and to see what kind of futures and aspirations people read in those infrastructures. So that might not necessarily be, some of it is maybe about their own everyday lives, and others are about sort of the ways in which the world might change beyond their existence, and sort of very sort of engagements with very sort of, I guess, different kinds of futures. And this is why I use the word sort of experiment, I guess, maybe in thinking about the kind of spaces that are built here as well, because I think experimentality in itself is about that kind of potentiality where different kinds of futures might emerge from those experiments that lead to maybe for some people to sort of like a post-oil futures, but for others It might be specifically about their own careers, about the sort of the kinds of experiences that they gain here might be sort of carried with them to other parts of the world to sort of for different purposes. So I think there is a sort of that's maybe a way in which you can read about these spaces without necessarily using the sort of the labels of success and failure, but sort of take a step back from success and failure and to say, okay, so what is in this moment, what is a way in which sort of people are thinking about that. And I think even in our conversation today, we were talking about sort of, okay, so what are the potentials for these sort of say the stadium spaces, or even for the sort of the subway stations that might what would be the residues of this beyond the World Cup. So I think that's sort of like maybe in a way a very presentist way of talking about these infrastructures, but a presentist manner that actually talks about sort of the about how people see the future today. So I think that's quite invigorating. But I also wanted to say something about the sort of the previous debate about the sort of the energy prices. I mean, there is now a sort of a shared grid across the Arabian Peninsula, which means that there's a shared electricity market, which also means that actually by subsidizing electricity prices here in Qatar, the Qatari government is actually paying for other citizens in other parts of the Arabian Peninsula to use electricity. So in a way, the presence of a shared grid means that there needs to be a sort of an unbundled electricity market for that grid to function in a more effective manner. So obviously the market economy is not the only way of managing a grid, but predominantly this has been the way in which grids are managed around the world. And so that's another reason why Saudi Arabia introduced an electricity price, because if Saudi Arabia kept subsidizing its citizens, then it would be subsidizing everyone else who's on that grid. So there is now sort of a shared system but I'm not sure if the blockade affected this frankly here. But I don't know if there's a sort of maybe there's a different kind of debate that emerges from that. But the presence of that shared infrastructure also sort of generates this kind of call for charging for electricity.
We have time for one more question. Perhaps we can take Zong and John's questions together.
Thank you. Sorry for butchering your names. I have a question for Professor Gunel and Professor Laurent. So what are GCC governments doing to mitigate their carbon output? If yes, what are they doing? If no, do you think they will plan to do anything in the future?
Zang, please, can you hand it to John?
So recently, I think you might know that OPEC Plus and Saudi Arabia has recently agreed to basically decrease the supply of oil coming into the world. What is the role of power politics in this case when it comes to sustainability issues, especially in the Qatari context? I know Qatar is not part of OPEC Plus and not likely to do the same things as Saudi Arabia did, but I'm quite curious to know what you think on this issue.
I can respond to the first question very briefly. I think one of the most important climate change mitigation mechanisms in the Arabian Peninsula has been carbon capture and storage. This is sort of the policy that all the GCC governments stood by at the UNFCCC meetings that Laurent was just mentioning, which happened across the street here. So that has been that's a sort of like in terms of international diplomacy, that's I think probably the most sort of the prominent mitigation strategy that was passed through the sort of the pressures put on by the GCC countries and at the UNFCCC level. Yeah.
I may add maybe to this that if we speak about mitigation, they are across the region trying to produce more electricity out of renewables, clearly, especially solar, which may seem to be obvious, but it's not. There is a lot of dust, so there are challenges, but still it's developing, mushrooming actually pretty fast now. The prices over the last 10 years have fallen, so this is why now it's very interesting. They are even considering using solar energy for the liquefaction of the liquefied natural gas tankers. So that the gas that needs to be liquefied at very cold temperature, which is quite a challenge you can imagine during August in Qatar, would be theoretically with renewables. So they are trying to deploy it at scale. Now we're far from it. I checked last year and I think renewables are still less than 1% of the power generation installed in Qatar, but it's developing. So this is the promising option that I see. And another thing which might be interesting is the development of hydrogen, including with carbon capture and storage for some, but it can be also made out of renewables. So this is something they consider a lot. With regards to the other question, I don't think there is any environmental consideration in the mind of the leaders of both Saudi Arabia and Russia when they decided to cut largely the production of oil. There was more a crude consideration of prices and how much economically it could benefit their both economies. In a time also where they tried to keep the energy markets really tight, not just for oil, but also for gas, because this keeps at a high level these two commodities, which are also commodities which have a very strong diplomatic and geopolitical dimension. So I guess, unfortunately, environment was out of the picture. Yes.
Oh, yeah, of course, there's a lot of power politics. Qatar left OPEC in 2019 claiming it would like to focus on gas, but of course it was a form of retaliation for the blockade. And I mean, the recent cutting of the energy production shows that Biden's visit to the US was a total failure. And that, in the past there was always this providing security by the US in exchange for cheap energy prices. And so times are changing. I would like to add to what my colleague said that, of course, one big debate is also on the use of nuclear energy. And we discussed, I think it was in our chat before, the nuclear power plant in the UAE. And so that's certainly discussion, I think, happening across the region, whether using nuclear, yes or no. Personally, I'm quite skeptical. There are only around 30 countries in the world which use nuclear energy, and the other 160 or 70 do pretty well without it. And it's causing a lot of problems. It's a costly technology, it's risky, and also there is a question of what's happening with the nuclear waste. So I see this personally more skeptical and would wish that countries follow a path towards renewable energies and welcome Qatar Energy's announcement to establish 5 gigawatt of photovoltaic by 2035.
Well, once again, I'd like to thank our panelists for their reflections and burnout. As a moderator, one of the good things about being a moderator, you have a lot of time to think because you don't do anything else, pretty much. And perhaps, maybe an attempt to bring all these discussions about energy sustainability and World Cup as this big singular event. I was thinking about an overlapping concept around the whole notion of play, right? Perhaps, a playful approach to energy sustainability, and you keep practicing, dang, to score a goal and so on. that could be a way, a utopian way, of course, of thinking about these two themes. Thanks again, and please join us for the reception.